Hey everybody, how is everyone doing? Welcome to my channel, The Magical Solution, here on YouTube and on Facebook. Happy 4th of July to all of you guys. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. So tonight we have a very, very special guest, and we're talking about a very, very controversial topic. Before we get into that, I would love to just remind everyone that the subject that we're going to be talking about, unfortunately, we're going to be going through it quite quickly, and we'll be touching on subjects very surface level, but we are going to encourage all of you to do the research yourself. We're definitely going to be listing a lot of resources. I'll be posting a lot of the resources in the comment section below. My guest will also have references to a lot of books that you can purchase on Amazon and online. And we highly, highly encourage you to go further with this research because it is in depth and it goes deep. So let's talk about my guest. Actually, I'm very, very excited. She is a dear friend of mine. If you haven't already seen the last live I've done with her, her name is Professor Wham. We did a live together about how white supremacy was sort of hijacking paganism, and we talked a lot about the history of paganism, and we talked a lot about the influences of paganism on that, and vice versa. And the conversation was 2 hours. It was enticing, fascinating. She's brilliant, and I absolutely love her, and I'm just so excited that she's joining me tonight to talk about this very, very important subject. You know, it's the 4th of July. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world, and I feel like today there's no better day than to talk about what we're going to talk about today, which is Nazi occultism here in America, okay? There's some very uncomfortable truths about America. I'll be joined by Professor Wham as we discuss how the wars that we are fighting right now also have a very real theater of combat in the spiritual realm. So we're really going to focus on that as well. We'll take a dive deep into the occult practices brought into America by former Nazis and Nazi collaborators who came to America in the aftermath of World War II, as well as the continued existence of these legacies and these practices today, including the psychological warfare, the dark energies, the ritual child sex trafficking, the abuse, the NLP, and so much more. So without further ado, let's introduce Professor Wham. Professor Wham has studied religion, new religious movements, occultism, and paranormal experiences for over 4 decades. And she has advanced degrees in religious studies and American cultural studies, and is an adherent environmentalist. She has practiced Sufism for over 2 decades and has studied Swedish, Finnish, runes, shamanism, and Mid-Hudson Algonquin indigenous traditions from native teachers. She has been a journalist and has also published poetry, short stories, academic papers, a textbook on new religious movements, and most recently, a survey of paranormal reports and experiences right here in the Hudson Valley. Mysterious Beauties Living with the Paranormal in the Hudson Valley is the name of the book. I highly encourage you guys to purchase that book and her online book, which we'll be talking about later in the show. And I highly encourage all of you guys to bring your questions forward, and we'll try our best to address them throughout the talk. So without further ado, let's bring in Professor Wham. Hey!
Baby metal.
How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you. Thank you for
having me. Oh my gosh. It has been a really long time since the last time you and I got together and really shook some shit up. And I'm excited to do it again.
So we shook shit up. Okay, good. Excellent. Excellent.
We really did. I don't know if you remember, but everything from the flyer of that last show all the way into the discussion and everything in aftermath of that was really, really controversial. We had people on their toes. So I'm excited to do it again today on the 4th of July here. So before we get started, let's kind of, if you can kind of recap a little bit on the last video, which will kind of lead us into our discussion today, which is Nazi occultism here in America. Can you do that for us?
Yeah, and I have the outline that we decided right here. So
yes, me too.
Look at all this. It's like 9 pages of notes. I actually typed them up this time. Okay. First of all, before I recap briefly, and this is going to be a brief recap, I needed to correct something that I misspoke last time. One of the things that I talked about towards the end of our talk was I talked briefly about the Greensboro Massacre, because that was the first large public event where the American Nazi movement and the KKK came together for the first time. Previous to that, they sort of operated independently of each other. And there are a number of reasons for that, both historical and ideological, which sounds odd to us now, but there have been some differences between the two groups. At the Greensboro Massacre is when they joined together in order to basically attack a peaceful protest of laborers, some of whom were communists or members of a socialist parties. Mostly it was just a labor protest, trying to get fair wages and conditions for African-American workers at a textile factory, essentially. I misspoke the date. I said that it was in 1970. It was not. It was in 1979. So it was not November 3rd, 1979. So if you think about it, it's not really that long ago.
No, it's not. And don't worry, we forgive you.
I know, but as a historian, that drives me crazy. When I was back through the video, I was like, oh, that's like wrong. Okay. Well, and especially since I actually know a couple people that were in it, as I mentioned, that are survivors of it.
Right.
And just to remind people who haven't seen the previous video, basically what we did was I hope that I established that pre-modern Northern European pre-Christian traditions were not racist. Basically, they don't have a race. There's no idea of race in them, at least not in a modern sense. I mean, all indigenous groups are a little bit tribal, in different ways.
Right.
They were not racist in the manner that we mean now. There was no idea of white supremacy. White supremacy is a much more recent development, and it's actually been traced historically by historians. There are a number of great historians, both of all races, who have traced this. So that was the first thing, because that was the big question that you wanted to ask me, is, in talking about runes and talking about use by heathenry of some of these pre-Christian symbols in the runes or the swastika or whatever, does that mean that these things are inherently racist in some way? And that's why these people use them. It's like, well, no, what people are doing is they're basically appropriating their ancestors' stuff in some instances and actually using them in ways they weren't used before and reinterpreting what those things mean now.
Right.
For all of the talk about appropriation, the cultural appropriation, I argue that if a white person, if a modern white person from the United States, it does not learn Northern European shamanism from a Northern European shaman, but then tries to take those symbols from those systems and use them in inappropriate ways, that is no less cultural appropriation than if they were to do that with any other,
I agree. Yeah.
Culture. So, and so that was part of what we talked about. And then the other thing we talked about was where white supremacy came from. And that's where we got a little bit into, I talked a little bit about the history of National Socialism and some of the occult ideas that were present among the Nazis. And then I also talked about the origins of the Nazi movement and the KKK, mostly the Nazi movement, because the KKK actually has two incarnations, which I don't know that I made clear last time. It was started immediately, about almost a year to the day, after the Civil War ended initially. And in its original charter, it explicitly refers to itself as a terror organization. And then it became illegal at a certain point, or it was sort of driven underground. And then in the early 20th century, ironically, during the middle of the First World War, long after the movie the Birth of a Nation, which of course is that infamous movie that was made glorifying the KKK. The KKK was reconstituted essentially. So it's kind of, and then it began, and then it was in the 1920s that it started to kind of respread, if you will. So that's the sort of thing that we talked about a little bit, is the origins of those white supremacy movements in the 20th century. We didn't get deeply into the connections between those movements and Nazism. Most of those American movements were not based in any kind of occultism. The vast majority of them, with some exceptions, the vast majority of white supremacy movements in the United States have been centered until recently around Christian identity movements.
Right.
And that's based on the British Israelite theory, which I can't even remember if we talked about that, but that's an idea that emerged in the late 19th century and argued essentially that that white people are the true Israel. They are the true Jews and the true chosen people. And the people that call themselves Jews are pretenders that have usurped the true Jews. So it's a kind of, it's a way of claiming, if you will, the Hebrew Bible for themselves, which is weird. But anyway.
Occultism. So it's two different schools. The white supremacy of the KKK is different from the Nazi occultism that's being.
Yeah, it is. It started out quite
very
different.
much more racial based, within that religious standpoint. But then that occultism that came in through the Nazis then filtered in kind of later on.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to talk about today, because there's some there's some very distinct threads that run into this. But so that's kind of summarizing, I think, what we talked about in the first video. But before I talk about everything tonight, I wanted to specifically focus on probably the word of the hour, which is that term fascism, so that people have an understanding of what fascism is. We tend to think of fascism as being associated principally with the Nazis, and it's because the Nazis did such horrible things with it. It's sort of like the exemplar in many ways of it. But fascism is a much broader thing. It's a much broader idea, and some of the ideas of fascism can find their ways into odd places, and so that's part of why we need to look at what this is. It's actually part of a philosophical movement that emerged in the late 19th century. But the term fascism was coined by Mussolini, or at least he's the one that's given credit for it. It was he who sort of thought of it in the way that we understand it now, which is a governmental system that is led by a dictator who has complete power, obviously authoritarian, but this is very important. It's the regimenting of industry to the state in a particular way. And it emphasizes an aggressive nationalism, and there's often a racial component. There doesn't have to be a racial component. And I'll give you some examples, but there often is one. And while it often has been associated with the right, leftist economic organization that can take on elements of fascism, especially if the socialism, because you have to remember the Nazis referred to themselves as National Socialists. Okay, so what is the difference between their socialism and, say, the federal socialism of the Soviet Union, who was their big enemy, Well, the main difference, as Mussolini saw it, the main difference was that you needed a charismatic leader and an aggressive nationalism, so that in a sense, the state becomes the religion. It's kind of like a religion of the nation, if you will. So and coupled with that is the joining of all economic activity to the government.
So the capitalism and the religious part all get kind of melded together
melded to the government
to create a narrative for the government to take full control of the system.
Right. In other words, all industry works on behalf of the government. Now, this is distinguished from at least the socialist ideal in the Soviet Union, or even in China, actually, where industry is at least defined as being something that's working for the people. Now, obviously, in both those instances, you had an upper class and an elite, and it doesn't quite work that way. But at least ideally, that was the notion. And certainly in China, they've developed a mixed economy where, industry, you can have a certain amount of free enterprise. It's regulated by the state pretty heavily, but there are people that can have individual businesses. In true fascist governments, all industry, whatever it is going to be working for the government, not for the people, but for the government.
Right.
And as a result of that, there's absolute authoritarian rule and suppression of opposition and the vilifying of anyone who is considered other. So that has often been racial or ethnic others, but there have been groups that have defined the other as, for example, the Khmer Rouge, which is it's often called a communist regime, but in fact it had a lot of elements of it that were fascist in a fairly classic way.
Right.
And the other in that instance was defined as anyone who had been tainted by Western culture. There's this kind of, in fascism, there's this kind of purity element. Mm-hmm. You've got to be a member of the party, and this purity element can, like I said, can often take a racial tone, but it can also take a kind of ethnic tone or cultural tone. You see some of those elements in Sri Lanka too.
Here in America, though, I mean, the way that I would kind of look at that, the way I would put that together, if that was what was happening here in America, which I feel that it is, you're looking at the government of capitalism, you're looking at the religion of money, and you're looking at the other as anyone who doesn't have money. And that could be across the board in terms of race, ethnicity. Us being a melting pot is a facade when you really think about what the other stands for. It really is who has money and who doesn't in this capitalistic sort of framework, if you will.
Right. So basically, fascism constitutes a kind of totalistic political religion, and that's really how Mussolini saw it. He saw the use of symbol and pageantry and a charismatic leader, using many of the same psychological and sociological techniques as a religious cult. So there's an obsession with perfecting reform, return to a mythical past. It's one of the things he talked a lot about, recasting the narrative, the historical narrative of the nation, so that there's this like return to a golden past. There's often the notion that there are mysterious outsiders that have invaded or upset a natural order. Now, if this all sounds familiar, it's because these elements are almost identical to the kinds of things you'll find in a fundamentalist cult.
Yes.
They're very, very similar. And so it's no coincidence whatsoever, I think, that certain types of evangelical Christianity fall right in line with this. Most cults are dual. I'll just give you some terms. These are religious studies terms, and this is for your audience so that they can think about this. Where have I heard this before? Most cults are dualistic, millenarian, and eschatological. Now, what does that mean? It means there's an absolute right and wrong. They tend to see history in simplistic stages that they claim are leading to them and their victory. And they often argue that they are fulfilling some kind of prophecy. And once they succeed, history and time will end.
But I feel like there's an element that's missing with that mythology storyline, because when you think about it in terms of like, the hero's journey, although there is that framework of there's us, there's them, there's the end game that technically belongs to us, and it's our right, it's our birthright, it's our divine right, whatever you want to call it. But then there's that element of we're the victim. We have to overcome something in order to get to that thing.
Well, that's what I mean. There's something has dethroned us.
Mm.
Golden age, something has dethroned us. And for Nazis, in the Nazi ideology, it is always the Jews. There are others who may be guilty of this too, or aiding and abetting Jews in one way or another. But Jews are always the enemy here, you know. And this is part of the reason why, as we go through this history a little bit, you'll see that Nazis often make interesting bedfellows. Like with Islamic fundamentalists who are, they also don't like the West for different reasons, but they also don't like the West. And it has more to do with the fact that the West has given them the shaft, so all this talk about liberalism and democracy and all this stuff has not borne fruit for a variety of reasons in the Islamic world. And of course, they see Israel as an enemy. The state of Israel as an enemy. So there's been common purpose there. But fundamentalist religions contain many of the same elements, and that's true whether those religions are Christian, Islamic, Jewish, Hindu, or Buddhist. So we have seen fascist elements
in Buddhism.
Yes, in Sri Lanka, in Thailand, the country where the Rohingya have been run out. That's an ethnic minority who happen to be a Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
But they're a different ethnicity, and they've been run out of places like Thailand, and in a very ethnic cleansing kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
Hundreds of millions of people, essentially.
I know when my husband and I have these conversations, because my husband is Indian, his family is from India, that's his culture. I know in India there's a lot of Hindu nationalism going on, a lot of war between the Hindus and the Muslims, and a lot of infighting. And there's some mirroring that I see there between that and what's going on in other parts of the world, and even here in America, that there's like this one group that kind of claims victim and claims total right to a particular area or a particular thing, and then just tries to wipe out or stop anything else from coming in, sort of like that stronghold. And it seems we thought, whenever we talk about this, we always think, peace in the Middle East, it only happens in the Middle East, they're so messed up over there, blah, 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 blah. But that you see it in pockets all over the world. That's not
right. No. And this is part of and there's a reason for that. There's actually a direct line between the BJP and esoteric Hitlerism, as it's called. There's a direct line.
Okay, we're going to talk about that.
So we will talk about that.
Yes.
And so basically what both fascism as a political ideology and fundamentalist monotheisms and other fundamentalisms are engage in what in Judaism is called forcing the hand of the Messiah. This is what I was telling you about, because they're impatient with what they think is taking too long for their needs to be met, whatever that is, and deciding that now is the time. Now, this is different from common political revolution, which may seem to start out that way or looks that way, but usually is not focused around a specific person, but a set of conditions or events. So that the Black Lives Movement, this is coming out of, this is a spontaneous emergence that is coming out of something that has been festering in the United States for a long time. And while George Floyd or Elijah McClain is sort of like just, they're the current instances that we're thinking of, they are the murders that tipped everybody else over the edge.
Right.
If most Americans, if you press them to the wall, they'll agree that some of these wounds have been festering for a long time. This is something that has been in the current of American culture since our beginning. And so it's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. And we're seeing it with the Native Americans as well. They're over there right now, Mount Rushmore, getting arrested, getting taken, getting beaten right now. And these are things that have been festering and have been happening since the beginning. And we're at a tipping point as a culture.
Yeah, normally people that are engaged in actual political revolution or uprising are somewhat aware that actually changing things is very complicated. I mean, we all know this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in fascism, person takes it upon themselves. Obviously, they have help, but in their own minds, they're taking it upon themselves to try to create changes they envision in their own image.
So people like Hitler and people like Trump.
Hitler, or Mussolini, right, or whoever. Right. There may be aspects of their vision, the needs they are attempting to address, that may be real and legitimate. And they're able to tap in to real and legitimate concerns and needs, but they will brook no discussion of their methods, particularly once they are in power. So basically, on a spiritual level, fascism, this is how I see it, fascism is the power of a collective ego, seduced and lured into thought form existence, and turned to meet the needs of only a few in any given population. For many people, it is powerful and alluring to be part of such a collective. So it should not surprise us that fascists, who are most of all drawn to power for power's sake, will use any mechanism, technique at their disposal to get their work of power over others done, including any kind of spiritual, magical, or occult techniques.
Oh, and we're gonna go right into those occult techniques right now. But Evelyn Borgano just made an amazing comment that we are going to be addressing in detail on the show tonight. But I just want to give you a shout out for being so ahead of the game. She wrote, "White nationalists brainwashing based on perceived victim mentality, based on white race victimhood and evangelical Christianity. In other words, if other races demand equality, that alone is enough to make white nationalists feel threatened. I'm just shocked. This explains the rage many of Trump supporters exhibit. They identify with Trump because, like Trump, they feel threatened, aka white fragility, aka white rage."
Right.
Wow.
AKA collective ego response is what it is.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And I know that sounds very psychological, but do not underestimate the power of that, because we all know individuals that ego problem individually, and they can do great destruction in just their private life just by having that. So if you think of a collective ego that has that same force, just think about that. It's kind of, So anyway, so let's talk specifically about Nazi occultism.
Let's do it. I accidentally put the little sign up too early the last time, but let's do it. Let's talk about it.
Now, and it's good that you put this up, old school Nazi occultism, because we are basically talking about there are two main forms of Nazi occultism. And I don't know anyone else that calls it this. This is my terminology. There's old school Nazi occultism, and then there's neo-Nazi occultism. So
let's do it. Let's talk it.
So the old school Nazi occultism are types of occultism that are associated specifically with the Third Reich, Germany. And this is a kind of interesting occultism. There have been some works that have been written about it, like there was a dissertation that was written about it, like I think it was in the early 80s by Nicholas Goodrick Clark, some of whose work I'll actually be showing you a little bit of. Lavenda, another author, sort of recast some of this. And it is true that there were some members of the Reichstag, of Hitler's close cronies, who were into occultism. And certainly this was investigated by some of those people. It really focused around Himmler, Rudolf Himmler. And he was the person who was the most obsessed, if you will, with the occult angle. And this all had to do with trying to figure out trying to come up with this mythical, heroic past.
Right.
That they believed they had been dethroned from in various ways. So the problem that Himmler faced, however, and I know I mentioned this to you yesterday, that when we were talking about this, is that there weren't a whole lot of what you would call completely authentic, whatever this means. And those of us in indigenous studies know that this is bullshit anyway. But authentic indigenous practices, because a lot of them had been interrupted, and even purposely, in the Christianization process of Europe. Now, there were still some folk things that existed, and there were still some things that were around, but none of it was really heroic enough, if you will, for the Nazis to use. And they certainly weren't going to use any Hermetic stuff, because that was all
too Jewish.
It's too Jewish. It's too much
Jewish. No.
Exactly. None of those names of Yahweh or any of that crap. So that was part of the reason, actually, why a lot of Nazis, some of you probably heard the story, actually traveled around the world trying to find, the true basis for the swastika and all this kind of stuff. And so basically what they did was they put together rituals that were based on folklore and pagan elements they could find. In fact, there were some occultists that did contribute, obviously, to the creating of symbols and things like that. What I don't know is that most of those occultists, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them ended up going to camps anyway, because they did not necessarily agree with their teachings being used in this particular way. They, Nazis in the obvious sense. And then there were other members of Himmler's group that were more interested in sort of like the Freemasons, and, the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, which were established in the 12th century, stuff like that. So a lot of them were Catholic. A lot of the really high-level officers were Catholic, so they drew on certain elements of Catholic ritual and Mass to create rituals. So it was a reconstructed paganism / Knights Templar / wherever the Grail is / whatever. Okay, but it was bolstered by this ideology in the state, essentially. And so that part of it was really, really strong. Now, the person who really kind of created the power of that ideology from a marketing perspective or a propaganda perspective was Goebbels, who was the minister of propaganda. And he was really aware of how powerful these symbols could be. And so he's the one who helped to create the pageantry, the large public rituals, the rallies, all those things that Hitler and the Nazi Party became used to be known for, and the big banners, and in fact, my father has one of these because my grandfather, his father, was a prisoner of war in a Nazi POW camp. Wow. And so when that war was liberated, a lot of people took a souvenir. So I've got one of those big, huge banners that goes all, I don't, what my dad does, it's got shrapnel holes in it and everything. It's huge. Wow. It's like we rolled it out once, and it's like, 30 feet long, So you had these huge things like that.
Which is all these theatrics, all this stimuli to affect all of the senses, to really get people engaged, exactly. Get people really on board with these ideas.
Right. And what's important about Goebbels is that he was a true believer. So was Himmler, but Goebbels really was. He had been sort of a socialist communist sympathizer until he read Mein Kampf in the 1920s, which of course was Hitler's autobiography. And he had kind of a conversion experience when he read it, according to him. And he had always been a fervent anti-Semite. And so for him, that was just like, oh my God, it was like, that was it. Hitler was it. So he was the one who basically created that pageantry. He's the one that pushed Hitler towards total war. He was the one that he didn't organize it, but he created the idea of the final solution, extermination camps, which were finalized in an hour and 15 minutes at a thing called the Wannsee Conference, which if y'all want to look that up, you can. He was the one that created the badges that Jews wore and that then other undesirables in the camps wore. And he was one of the few top-level Nazi officials to always openly and explicitly support the activities that were occurring in the camps. He never denied it.
Wow.
And so this should tell you something about, did the Germans know? Did the West know? Did they believe it? Whatever. He never denied it.
Wow.
You know, I mean, he was very open about it.
It was so just in your face, and people. So why?
You could compare him to Stephen Miller, sort of, in our own.
Was it
in our own administration?
So fantastical? Was it because it was so fantastical and just so unbelievable that people just didn't take it seriously and was like, no, that's not really happening over there. Like, that can't be.
Well, I think
that they believed it, but they just didn't care.
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, think about it. First of all, there is a war going on, so people are kind of dealing with that. But it is true that in World War I, the Germans were vilified, and there was a lot of propaganda about them that wasn't true. And they were blamed for that war when, in fact, they were no more at fault than anybody else was about the war. They just had better material and kicked out.
Which right there is your victim story. So
and that was exactly the victim story.
Yeah,
that Hitler used.
Yeah,
it was in a sense, you know, we did vilify them for that. But at the same time, you know, blaming that on the Jews and a whole host of other things that's going way overboard. But you know, it's hard knowing why people deny those kinds of things. I think part of it is because it's hard to believe. I mean, I certainly know that there are accounts that I have read of Jewish survivors of the camps and other people who were in the camps who survived. I think we all have to remember that there were 6 million approximate Jews that were in the camps, but there were almost 6 million other people.
Yeah.
In the camps too. Yeah. So there were lots of people killed in the camps. And there have been several accounts that I've read where not Nazi soldiers, you know, guards would say, well, you know, we're doing these things because they're, you know, nobody will believe that we're doing them. So
no one will believe that we're doing it. Wow. And you know what? They weren't wrong. They were not wrong. I mean, you know, you can even see that happening today. You know, they talk about this whole theory of, oh, the revolution will not be televised. And there's a psychology behind that too. There's a reason why it's not being televised, obviously. But there's also that piece of it of, the less people see, the less they'll believe it's happening. So right now, while Native Americans are being, you know, hosed down, arrested, or children being taken and trafficked, because it's not seen and it's not in the forefront, people do not believe that it's happening. I mean, just this live right now, the live that we're doing right now, there are going to be non-believers, even though you're going to be stating facts, even though you're going to be giving resources, even though the information is blatantly in your face and easily attainable, people will deny it because it's just so fanciful. It's so just fucking out there, you know, that we can't possibly believe, like, wow, there are groups of people who are using ancient symbols to create rituals to obtain power to eventually take over the world. What? What the fuck?
Well, I'll put it this way. There's a brilliant line. I don't know if you're familiar with Twin Peaks, but there's this. Once you find out who killed Laura Palmer, and it isn't clear who killed Laura Palmer, whether it was actually her father who killed Laura Palmer, or whether it was. For those of you who haven't seen it, sorry, this is a spoiler. Or whether it was the personality, the evil personality that possessed him, Bob, that killed Laura Palmer. And so anyway, there's this dramatic thing where Leland, Laura Palmer's father, dies, and Bob, the spirit who's been possessing him, escapes. And it creates all this crazy stuff. And so in the next scene, you see, you know, the law enforcement officers, and they're talking about this, and they're like, they can't believe that they have witnessed like a spirit come out of a person, and that was responsible. You know, in other words, they'd never seen that before, so it's difficult for them to believe that this was a spirit that had done all these terrible things. And Agent Cooper, the main protagonist, says, well, is it easier to believe that, or is it easier to believe that a father would rape and torture and murder his own daughter?
Wow. Yeah.
Which, you know, in other words, which is more awful here? That's kind of what we're dealing with here.
Wow. Yeah.
We're dealing with the origins of human evil, and what is that? Is that in us, or is that from some other place, or is some mixture of both these things? So anyway, to finish up Goebbels' story, he was such a believer in Hitler that 4 days after Hitler died, or was reported to have died, and I'll talk about why that's important later, he and his wife and his 4 children committed suicide.
Woo.
So he, so basically, he couldn't live without his savior, essentially.
Wow.
It's long been known, and it was known even then, up to a year prior to the war ending and Hitler dying. As soon as it became clear to the Nazi leadership that they were not going to win the war, that the Nazi leadership began to contrive a plan to escape, so that Nazi ideology could survive. We're still talking about old-style Nazism here.
We are? I jumped to it? Sorry.
We're still talking about old-school Nazi occultism here, all right? I'll tell you when we stop. And so these escape routes had already been established by the time that the war ended. And the reason we know this is because, well, our military intelligence had already established this.
Yes.
This was already known. And they were called rat lines. That was the name that the Allies gave them, was rat lines. And in fact, as the war ended and Nazi officials and the higher ups started escaping, we were trying to nab them, in various places, because many of them were war criminals. But we were also trying to nab them for other reasons, which I'll talk about in a minute. There was a network that the Nazis had set up. And this network had to do with Nazi sympathizers that lived in various places of the world. There were Nazi sympathizers that lived in South America. There were Nazi sympathizers in large colonies that were in Indonesia and in several places in the Middle East. And so they were going to be funneled into these different areas. And there were 2 main rat lines. The first one went through Italy, went through the Vatican. And yes, there were members of the Vatican who assisted. The Catholic Church did assist many high-level Nazis to escape, and a lot of them were funneled into the Middle East and then into Southeast Asia and into Indonesia, which had a very large expat Nazi sympathizing community. Still there, by the way. It's still there, by the way. Then there were large Nazi sympathizing communities in Chile and Argentina and Uruguay. Some of these colonies had been established by German immigrants, but some of them had been established very early, right after the American Civil War, by plantation owners who refused to go through the Reconstruction process in the United States. And so they just picked up all their crap and their slaves and took them to certain enclaves in South America. And so they were already kind of there. And those people were funneled through Spain, which was still a fascist country at the time, Franco's Spain. So this network, it wasn't nearly as organized as the rumors had it. The American intelligence called it Odessa, and it has sort of come down through, rumor as being like an organization that was doing this. No, it was a network. It was never that organized. But essentially what ended up happening were several things. One is that there developed very early this rumor that Hitler had not died. And this is important for later Nazi occultism. And while most historians think he probably did kill himself, because that's actually what despotic rulers like that tend to do, we also know that there were at least a dozen doubles of Hitler. There had been multiple assassination attempts of Hitler, especially throughout the World War itself, from about 1938 onward. Probably more than 3 attempts, serious attempts at assassinating him. And as a result of that, there were a large number of doubles that had been hired, if you will, people that looked like him more or less. I mean, he was actually kind of nondescript in appearance by German standards. He looks infamous to us now. It's only because we've had to stare at him a billion thousand times. But and these people would sometimes, if there was like a long distance photo op, or they would act as distractors or whatever. Well, it is known that some of these people escaped, and at least in 2 separate instances. Well, not just Argentina and Brazil, but also in Indonesia. Peter Levenda has a very, very good has a very, very good story about a guy was probably one of these doubles who, at least in Indonesia, up to the point of his death, was able to convince all of his neighbors that he was Hitler. And in fact, his grave in Indonesia has Adolf Hitler on the gravestone. So he probably wasn't Adolf Hitler, but he certainly convinced his neighbors that he was. The point is that that created the rumor that Hitler had not died. And American intelligence was perfectly willing to let that rumor fly sometimes. And the reason for that was because Stalin of the USSR was obsessed with that idea that Hitler had not died. And so this was a way to sort of confuse the issue, throw him off, freak him out, do that sort of thing. The other thing that the military U.S. military services and intelligence services wanted to do is they started dipping into these rat lines and pulling out people, Nazi officers that they would bring to the U.S. And there were several of these projects, but the one that's probably known the best is Project Paperclip. That's probably the most famous of them. There were several of these, actually. And the purpose of this was to establish an intellectual and scientific brain trust, because the Nazis were known to be really skilled in the areas of psychological warfare, rocketry, and the nuclear industries, air power, exotic technologies, and biological warfare. So those were the things that they knew really well, and those are things we wanted to develop because we knew the Soviets were trying to work on these things. So we wanted the Nazis to help us. So basically what we did was we made a deal with the devil. And people who were guilty of extraordinary war crimes, we brought over here. And with their knowledge, we were able to do things like upgrade our weapons systems and create NASA and do all kinds of stuff like that, as well as develop or at least attempt do testing to develop various types of brainwashing capacities, psychological warfare capacities, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. The U.S. intelligence also assisted one of the rat lines in funneling members of the Nazi Air Force, Navy, and armed services into select Middle Eastern governments to assist local rising Muslim dictatorships in creating armed forces for themselves. And this was in order, obviously, to keep the Soviet Union at bay, to keep them from coming in and taking over any of those governments. So basically, the militaries of Iraq, Egypt, Syria, Israel, irony intact, Jordan and Saudi Arabia, with official Nazi help. And it's actually the basis for parties like the Ba'ath Party, which was the party that Saddam Hussein was part of, but it's also the party that Bashir in Syria is part of, and Bashir is Shia, at least officially, and Hussein was Sunni. So it doesn't make any difference what cult you are, sectarian-wise. The Ba'ath Party is a proto-Nazi party. It's a fascist ideology.
So do you feel that the rumor of Hitler not being dead, that contributed? Do you feel like that contributed to the rediscovery of
part of it? Certainly part of it.
Thing?
Certainly part of it. Yeah, certainly part of it. And let me just finish this last little bit I was going to do. And then finally, the U.S. intelligence also trained what were called elite chaos attack squads. And what they were fascist troops. They were, like SS troops, fascist troops in Italy. This originally was going to be in Italy, but it spread throughout Europe as part of something that was called Operation Gladio. And these were fascist troops that were permitted to stay behind in their countries of origin to operate behind the scenes and carry out terrorist-like raids on any communist cells that might develop in those countries.
Wow.
So what that did was it kept fascism alive.
It sure did. And it seemed like America played a huge part in kind of puppeteering, where these where they sent these Nazis and what their role was in those places in order to kind of, create a system that puts America on top in a way. Like they just
Exactly.
kind of,
well, and also fights. This is all part of the Cold War stuff.
yeah.
Now the one other area that the old order Nazis sort of plugged into was the development of certain psychological warfare techniques that the Nazis had been working on for a while, and then were started to be used in certain clandestine American projects. There was this obsession with the CIA in particular to see whether it was possible to create a kind of psychological super story, a super soldier, if you will. And this was because they were convinced that the Russians were working on this as well.
Mm-hmm.
The idea basically, this is what you have, the idea of the Manchurian candidate, someone who can be brainwashed. You think that they're normal, they're programmed, but they can look normal, and then you send the control word, and they turn into the super soldier.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, there was a movie I would recommend everybody, if you can, on Netflix or YouTube, wherever it is, watch the movie The Manchurian Candidate.
It's a great movie.
From the early 1950s, and it really exemplifies kind of Cold War paranoia that the CIA had, but also was feeding into the American population in a certain way. So what the Nazis did was they contributed various psychological techniques that have come down to us in different ways. So if any of your people, if any of your listeners are familiar with the clandestine drug experiments of MK Ultra, Project Artichoke, Project Bluebird, all of these things were run by, were initiated by these Nazi brain trust people. And in fact, NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, can be traced directly to these kinds of experiments. But the reason that this is important in terms of occultism is that there are still some of these old practitioners around. They're older than dirt, but they have passed on some of these ideas and techniques to their own spiritual proteges. They often are not part of normal neo-Nazi groups. I happen to know of a few of them. My attention has been brought to them, to me about them. There is a group of them here in the Hudson Valley, and they do very, very high-level occult working based almost entirely in the mind and hypnotic techniques. You would never know just by looking at them, because they evince nothing external about that.
Right, they're just a regular Karen and Kyle right next door.
They are connected intimately to these techniques that were brought over and that became part of the CIA's arsenal, if you will, or experimental arsenal. Part of the reason why some of these things got dropped here and there is that a lot of this stuff turned out to be not nearly as successful or useful as, at least initially, as previously thought. But anyway, so then let's get into the more interesting stuff. And this is where India comes into this. While this is all happening in the 1940s and the early 1950s, there are other people who are having interesting and odd experiences with Nazism. And while at first they are just unique, weird individuals, eventually what ends up happening is that their ideas become pivotal to new emergent esoteric Hitlerism, as you have it on the board, or have it up here. The first person to talk about is Savitri Devi, which actually I told you I had this book.
This chick is fucking batshit. Oh my gosh, I read about her and I'm just like, oh my Lord.
Okay.
But
and
she was loved.
There's actually a picture of her right here.
Yeah.
This is when she's a little bit older. So Debbie was a very interesting, odd English woman who was very disaffected, I guess, with being an English woman. I don't know, but she ended up going to India in the 1930s and 1940s. So she was kind of separated, from the main part of the war. But she became fascinated with Hitler and followed his rise to power. And her story is entirely too complicated to entirely go into. She's interesting in her own right just because of how odd she is. But the reason why she was drawn to India is that she became convinced that Indian Hinduism, which, by the way, is a late Indian development, Hinduism with the H, Vedanta, I guess, is as it became to be called. She became convinced that Indian Hinduism could provide a key by which the Aryan races could reestablish themselves and free themselves from the tyranny of Jewish Christian thought. And this was based on 19th century philology, which did link Sanskrit as a language, a part of the Indo-European language family, and in that regard is connected to the Greeks and to Russian, and to it's a huge language family. She was also part Greek, and so she had been inculcated in Greek nationalism, which became which was very important after World War I because of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So there was this whole thing between the Greeks and the Turks, which still exists on the island of Macedonia, but we won't go there. Cyprus is on the island of Cyprus, not Macedonia. Macedonia is not an island. Anyway, on the island of Cyprus. Anyway, forget that. So she was deeply into Greek nationalism, and somehow this, the whole story is that she ends up becoming a Hindu, essentially. She marries a Brahmin, and basically adopts an entirely Hindu way of dress. She learns Urdu, she learns Hindi, so she's able to convert. She's very fluent in them, so she's able to converse in those languages. And she developed this theory, basically, that Hitler. Now, she did believe Hitler died, okay. Although I think she tended to believe that he was killed, so that he was a martyr. But she did believe that he died. And that he was an avatar of Vishnu in the Hindu pantheon. And in fact, a figure no less than Swami Satyananda agreed with her about this. Okay, so this is, and keep in mind, this is immediately prior to Indian independence, which happened right after World War II, like in 1947, 1948, something like that. So, and the independence was looming. England knew they were going to lose the Raj. It was looming, but there was a big disagreement among people in India as to how that was going to happen, how India was going to be, organized and ruled. And of course, Gandhi had his vision. And there were other people who had visions. There were people who had nationalist visions, and she was firmly on the side of the nationalists. And so she basically created this myth, and this myth is very complex. This myth has to do with Hitler being an incarnation of Vishnu, and that his martyrdom had ushered in the age of Kalki, which is the age of the iron-fisted ruler that would bring the age of Kali to an end. And that eventually she hoped that the entire world would be set up like India in a caste system. She saw in that caste system that, and in fact, the word, a lot of people don't know this, but the word varna, which means caste in Sanskrit, also means color. So there is some evidence that it was color based in some way in India. But whether that had to do with race as much as it had to do with the fact that people who don't go out and work in the fields tend not to be so dark as people who don't, from American standards, all Indians are pretty dark, people who come from India. So
no, there's definitely colorism that goes on over there just as much as it does over here. Right. And there's definitely locale issues going on. People in the North feel superior than people in the South, et cetera, et cetera. And we're seeing that even here in America. What it sounds like, though, from what you're talking about, it sounds like these rat lines, and it sounds like these these pockets that are happening all over the world of these Nazis, it sounds like they're kind of collecting, if you will, all the like the occult stuff of those particular areas and sort of like kind of bringing them, like coalescing them in a way into some kind of grand white.
Well, it's a grand reinterpretation.
Yeah.
In fact, if you look at her book, this is in the beginning of her book. This is the 1958 edition, by the way. If you get on Amazon, you can get the more recent one if you want it. But basically, they're claiming Akhenaton, the monotheistic ruler of Egypt. They're claiming Genghis Khan. She has this whole sort of rubric as of men in time, men above time, men against time. And these are like her three kind of heroic messianic movements, if you will. And so she's giving examples of this. And Hitler is, I believe, is a man, where is he? I think he's a man against time. But he's also he's the child of light. He's the late-born child of light. And so she's really the first person to actually just simply proclaim that Hitler is the Messiah. He's a messianic.
Yeah, she created like the foundational myth. That's
one of the foundational myths.
Wow.
And connecting it to India specifically, kind of taking Indian myth and also theosophy, which is based, Blavatsky stuff, which is based a lot on the idea of the root races and all that kind of stuff. She was not part of the theosophical movement. She was not. But she did borrow some of those ideas and some of the language, but she was not a theosophist. Because at the core, what theosophy argues, even though it has some racialist elements in it, at the core, what it argues is that all religions basically come from one place. So it is, in that sense, universalist. She's not arguing that at all. And in fact, would be completely against that. Okay. Yeah. So she struggled all of her life, basically, to sort of promote this, and ended up dying in
lonely and homely.
Well, she died at the home of a friend, right? But it would take a while before people began to see her value, and in fact, would take the writings of a different guy who I will introduce now. His name was Miguel Serrano, and he was a Chilean diplomat. And by the way, there is a deep course of pro-Nazi fascist thought that is deeply embedded in certain aspects of South America. But he was a Chilean diplomat, a writer, and an occultist, and a fascist activist. And now he came to Hitlerism through his own anti-Semitism. He was virulently anti-Semitic, even as a very young person. And while the war was raging in 1942, he was also interested in yoga and in occultism. In 1942, he joined an occult order that had been founded by a German migrant to Chile. And this person had fused certain elements of ceremonial magic with yoga and with Nazi ideology. And so he became sort of wrapped up in this. Now, it was Serrano who became convinced that Hitler had not died.
Okay.
So he became convinced that Hitler was still alive around in the world and was operating as sort of a way by which these different Nazi groups could still connect, the old order Nazis, so to speak. Now, in 1953, he joined the Chilean diplomatic corps and was stationed in India. So he also has this Indian connection. And it was in India that he became connected up to some of Savitri Devi's ideas, although he had some of his own ideas as well. And then he ended up coming, he traveled around the world as a diplomat, and then he ended up coming back to Chile, where he worked as a diplomat for a while. But then when Salvador Allende, who was a Marxist, of course, came to power, he was out of power until Pinochet overthrew him, and then he became part of Pinochet's dictatorship.
Mm.
And what he used to do was he became a prominent organizer in the Chilean neo-Nazi movement. He always held annual celebrations of Hitler's birthday, and the same kind of thing. Now, what he did was he added a whole other level to this myth, this story. And this had to do with not only his exposure to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which you should be familiar with. That is that fraudulent anti-Semitic screed that has been, that's the thing that promotes the idea that there's a Jewish conspiracy. But he also joined another occult order, this time out of Germany. And he's never revealed who this person was. And this individual apparently had been working as an occultist since the early 20th century, had survived claimed anyway, that they had survived all of both world wars, and that they had maintained connections to the Nazi party, but had also remained somewhat separate. And that they had done basically for Nazism what Aleister Crowley did for ceremonial magic.
Yeah.
He only knows him as FK. All right. So this FK claimed that this was a story that FK this is actually directly from Wikipedia. FK claimed that the group owed its allegiance to a secretive Brahmin elite from India who resided in the Himalayas. It practiced combined Kundalini yoga with ceremonial magic and expressed a pro-Nazi position. It espoused a belief in an astral body which could be awakened through various rituals and meditative practices. The group revered Adolf Hitler as the savior of an Aryan race and presented him as let me read this here, a Shuddha Buddha Baba or something, an initiate of immense willpower who had voluntarily incarnated onto Earth to assist in the overthrow of the Kali Yuga, a present dark age for humanity. He also claimed that doing these various rituals that he had come in contact on the astral plane with various spiritual entities that were interested in helping to promote these esoteric practices in the fulfillment of this Nazi ideology.
Wow.
So, and so basically initiated Serrano into these practices, such as they were. So Serrano then began, and he developed this entire mythology. So let me see if I can summarize this mythology. He wrote. He coined the term esoteric Hitlerism, which is what it's called now. And he described it as a new religious faith that is able to change the materialistic man of today into a new idealistic hero. And it is not only much more than a religion, it is a way to transmute a hero into God. And he's God with a big G, not a little g, but a big G.
Wow.
And this is his in his 643-page tome, Adolf Hitler, The Last Avatar, which is dedicated to the glory of the Fuhrer, Adolf Hitler. He tells his story. So this is important because this is the story, this is the cosmology that is underlying occult groups like the Order of the Nine Angles, which was the occult order that American army person, they were going to do a terrorist attack against his compatriots.
So what you're about to say is the foundation of these.
This occult order, and part of the basis for esoteric Hitlerism. There has been a vast historical conspiracy to conceal the origins of evolved humankind. Extragalactic beings founded the first Hyperborea, a terrestrial on this earth, but non-physical realm, which was neither geographically limited nor bound by the circles of reincarnation. They were asexual and reproduced through plasmic emanations from their etheric bodies. And then he uses this term, which should be familiar to you, the vril power. So this is a coinage that's taken from Sir Bulwer Lytton's book, the Vril, which of course he had no idea that his work was going to be used this way. But the Vril power was theirs to command. The light of the black sun coursed through their veins, and they saw with the third eye. He contended that the last documents relating to them were destroyed along with the Alexandrian library, and that that latterly these beings have been misunderstood as extraterrestrials arriving in spaceships or UFOs. However, they were immaterial and altogether outside of our material universe. The material universe is under the jurisdiction of the demiurge. So this is a kind of Gnosticism.
Right.
Okay. An inferior godlet whose realm is the physical planet Earth. The demiurge had created a bestial imitation of humanity in the form of proto-human robots like Neanderthal man, and had intentionally consigned his creatures to an endless cycle of involuntary reincarnation. The Hyperboreans recoiled in horror from this and are seeking to reclaim and liberate true humanity. So basically, the darker you are, the closer you are to being one of these entrapped minions,
right,
of the demiurge.
that are destined to be reincarnated and enslaved over and over and over again,
exactly,
versus themselves as being some sort of ethereal, outer worldly kind of beautiful race of being.
Right. And so the world is basically a combat zone between the dwindling Hyperboreans, of which there are fewer and fewer because it's all being bred out, and the demiurge and his forces of entropy. But Serrano claims that the golden age can be reattained if the Hyperboreans' descendants, the Aryans, consciously repurify their blood to restore the divine blood memory.
Wow. So,
okay. It's got like extraterrestrial stuff and
so much to unpack, and we don't even have the time for that. But I will say this. So when they speak about the Vril, when they speak about the black sun, these are actual images that are still being used today. Like we're still seeing these. They're in the form of sigils or symbols or occult, talismans, if you will, that are used in today's practices, even today.
No, most specifically today. Now, ironically, I've worked to trace this idea of the black sun and the green ray, as they call it, and in a book that I gave to you the manuscript of it, I believe that I have found the source for this. And ironically, the source for the idea of the black sun and the green ray comes from Sufism, but it's used in a completely different context. It's used in the context that the black sun is used to describe an experience that the ego has, the common ego of the personality, that it has when that ego is effaced and erased in a spiritual experience. And, shamans will talk about this, their ego is shattered. And it's when your personality confronts the totality of the immenseness of the spiritual realm. And you realize that the ego has to be transformed in service to this higher plane, in a sense. Or to these beings that you are committing yourself to, or to this reality that you're committing yourself to. And it's a terrifying experience. So the way that it's described in some Sufi literature is as if there was, we call it the dark night of the soul. In Christian terms, that's what it's called. It's that realization that sense, that feeling that you are nothing. That you are nothing in the face of this. And it's not that your true essence, it's nothing. It's that you realize that your ego is a construct and your ego is nothing, but this gets retranslated and retransformed in this idea that the black sun is actually a place. It actually is a signal of the non-physical location of where the Hyperboreans came from.
It came from nothing. Yeah.
But in any case, so that's sort of the background of all of this. So in service to that, there are all kinds of really interesting and odd rituals that people do. I mean, people do the same kinds of ceremonial rituals that, anybody does.
Right.
Now, when it comes to if you want to find out about what the Order of the Nine Angles does, all you have to do is get on Amazon and get one of their books.
Wow.
I mean,
It's that
available.
Yeah, it's so in the open. I mean, these groups that are here in America and stationed all over the world are very much not hiding. They are very much not afraid to be who they are and do what they're doing. But there are secret practices and there are secret ceremonies that we don't know about, that are behind the scenes that kind of assist and help orchestrate a lot of the bigger picture things that are happening on this planet, especially here in America. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about that. But so that esoteric Hitlerism and that mythology.
Well, here's a book you could that is available. It's called The Black Sun: Aryan Cults, Esoteric Nazism, and the Politics of Identity. By Nicholas Goodrick Clark, and he talks. And this is a book that is a collection of essays, and he talks about the origins of this stuff, its connections to India. He talks about Savitri Devi, the Nazi mysteries. What the SS, the people of the SS that were occultists, what they were doing, the relationship between this and Antarctica, legends about Antarctica, and technology. And he also talks about then in the 1980s, when you had sort of the rebirth, if you will, the rebirth of runic, heathenry. And the role that played in it. And that's kind of an interesting, I mean, I talked a little bit about that in the first video, but there always were two streams in heathenry in the United States. And one was a stream that was very much connected to neo-Nazi stuff, okay? There always was that. But then there was another stream that was not at all, and I talk about that. And those two streams have kind of they've diverged in the two most recent decades, and I do talk about that in the previous video. But the person who sort of straddled the line on that was Edward Thorson, who has since decided that it's okay for him to be Stephen Flowers, and has completely left that community entirely. And that's a whole story in and of itself. The one thing that I did want to add here that I forgot is that I mentioned that until recently, most old school Nazis really had nothing to do with new esoteric Nazis or with the KKK or the Nazi, the American Nazi movement. And there were a variety of reasons for that. Partly in the beginning, it was because, frankly, American neo-Nazi groups were relatively not sophisticated, intellectually or otherwise. And also because a lot of these groups were initially connected to Christian identity groups. So there was no interest in that at all. So what a lot of the old Nazis ended up doing was they maintained positions that were connected, as I mentioned, to intelligence or military services. Or the other thing they did, and this is how they made their money, was they associated themselves with various organized crime syndicates, all of which proliferated widely in the post-war and especially the post-Cold War period. So if you look at the various organized crime syndicates in the world, of which there are about 4 main blocks of them in the world, you can see old Nazi influence in connection with the Italian mafia, the Yakuza in Japan, certain Middle Eastern, and definitely South American cartels.
Wow.
However, Central American and Mexican cartels are separate, and Russian and Chinese cartels are separate. So there are a lot of people who behind the scenes have looked at the last election, and 45's connection to I mean, he has a long history of being connected to the Russian mafia. I mean, we know this. I mean, this is not surprising. Now, why he would be using fascist stuff now, I think, personally, I think it's because he is banking on these people keeping him in power. I don't think he personally believes in any of it. I think he's personally terrified, actually, of what is going on. I think he's out of control, and he's barely kind of functional in his own brain. But he's hoping that this is the group that will keep him in power.
Mm.
That will. He's been given a promise somewhere that he will stay in power if he does this. And I'm not sure what that means exactly, because I don't know all the conversations, obviously, behind the scenes. But what's going on here is less about politics as usual and is more about various of these organized crime syndicates shifting and seeing how they can operate. And yes, various of our billionaires are connected to some of these syndicates.
Right.
Not all
and, speaking of these crime rings, so let's skip over a couple of these topics that we were going to go in, because I think we can always circle back. But to speak about these crime syndicates, so we're looking at drug cartels, we're looking at human trafficking, we're looking at all kinds of crime. I mean, just in general, just these large crimes.
Right.
Why? So what is the purpose of the human trafficking? Like, how does that fit into not just political fascism? I think we kind of know, we know what that means, but on a spiritual / occult / what does that have to do with that? Like,
okay.
why?
Well, what syndicates do, what human and drug traffickers do, is they supply a need. That is their goal. You supply a need, and people are going to need humans, usually young children, humans, or drugs for different reasons. So some people are going to need children as sex slaves, and I'm going to try to be I have to be blunt here, as sex slaves. Some people are going to use children as part of that sex slave stuff. Some of these people who are occultists are going to use them in that way. They're going to use children because there is this occult idea that if you can torture or hurt an animal or a child, that the fear and the pain and the anguish of that experience, that energy can be used in an occult way. I'm not saying this happens a lot. I'm not trying to start a satanic panic here.
Right.
But it is
but
clear.
There's a reality to that. I mean, anyone who understands
that there are people who do this.
Right.
And there's actually a book which is out of print, which I highly recommend if you can find it. It's called The Highest Altar. And I can't even remember I'll find out the author of it really quick. It's called The Highest Altar, and it is the only journalistic examination I have ever seen, where this man actually does a historical and sociological report on practices of human sacrifice in the world. And he comes across things that he put his own life in danger to report on some of this stuff. We all know that there are human sacrifices that are occurring at least occasionally in Mexico and Central America on behalf of the drug cartels. I mean, this is not news. I mean, even when people get, just sort of offed by some of these groups, some of the ways in which they're killed has a very ritualistic component. And that has been noticed by lots of people. So, you obviously need people to do that with. There have also been companies, or the CIA needed this for a little while. You might, if you're doing any kinds of experiments, biological experiments with people, or you need certain types of labor, you will traffic human beings in order to do that. We know, for example, and this has been confirmed, we know that, for example, during this pandemic, the Chinese have been using the Uyghurs that they've been keeping, this ethnic group that they've been keeping in concentration camps in Western China. They were using them to man their infrastructure during the pandemic to make sure that that electricity and water and all that stuff was running, and not caring at all whether these people were exposed and dying, because they literally didn't matter. It's by Patrick Turney, The Highest Altar.
Right.
But basically,
and it's hard to give insight or to hypothesize as to why, for example, children go missing or children get trafficked, or women go missing. But if you were to look at it just from a sheer esoteric level, if you were to just stare at it as an occultist and as someone who understands how energy works, it makes a lot of sense to when it comes to sacrifice, when it comes to torture, when it comes to manipulating energy in any which way. It can be reused and refiltered and redirected and all of that for magic and for magical purposes.
Right.
And that those magical purposes could be infinite reasons as to why. They could be using that magic to take control of land. They could be using that magic to hypnotize a group of people. They could be using that magic to take over a country, whatever. I mean, the hypotheses are endless. But the fact that this is happening just in general is something we need to be mindful of. We may not know the reasons why. We may not understand what their purposes are, but we know children are going missing. We understand that there are occult systems in place right now. And we understand that the idea of sacrifice, torture, and energy manipulation is a very real thing. So whether they're all connected, we can create stories about that left and right, but there's a reality to it.
Well, when it comes to the syndicates, basically what's happening is that you have as I was telling you yesterday, the convergence of interests. You have people who you have people over here who need children for whatever, and then you have people over here who simply want immigration to cease in the United States, and then you want people over here, and I'm just talking about the United States. You have people over here who would love to get the indigenous people off the land so that they can get the mineral rights and the land rights, and so you have these convergence of interests, which results in the disappearance of many, many indigenous women constantly, virtually, in a lot of indigenous communities in the United States. It should surprise absolutely no one,
right?
That among the children that have been caged and housed in these places down at our border, that human traffickers have been, posing as adoption agencies and taking these kids away. And
yeah, that's another piece. I'm glad that you brought that up, because it is not. You can actually find this information anywhere. That it's
not. The New York Times reported on it 2 years ago. It's not.
What's the right word? It's not news. The fact that you have human traffickers, you have people who are working for these occult systems, you have people that have been placed there by Nazi sympathizers within America in places like adoption agencies, social service agencies, domestic violence agencies, police forces, all kinds of systems where people have to move through, and children have to move through, and women have to move through, but not just women, children, and people, but vulnerable women, children, and people have to move through these systems and are being lost. And you see that with the border as well. 4 rounds of 1,500 kids disappearing.
Right.
Track 4 rounds of that.
Right.
A very specific number. That tells you something. That's not normal. Right.
Well, and then there's this. This is you can try to get through this book if you want. It's one of the grimmest books I've ever read. But this book right here by Nick Bryant, called The Franklin Scandal. The Franklin Scandal was a human and sex trafficking network that was uncovered in the late 80s. And the reason it's important to me was that I had, unbeknownst to me at the time, I had a really weird connection with part of it. And that was, it was terrifying to find that out. But basically, Nick Bryant is a journalist who has spent his entire adult life, his entire professional life, tracking down human trafficking networks and trying to expose them in various ways. And he, of course, he finds himself running up into roadblocks at every turn, because a lot of the people that these kids are funneled for whatever reason, are rich people or governments, people who can pay and can pay to keep people quiet. And so what this is basically his description of his investigation into the Franklin scandal. But he says this is just the tip of an iceberg.
Right.
You cannot expect the players that were part of this, which, by the way, the guy who was in charge of this, and this was in the late 80s, he basically spent 8 years in prison, got his hand slapped, and was set free. We have no idea where he is. Now, the notion that he would quit doing this is insane.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like he would just go underground and do it more effectively. So...
and then for a moment, let's put humans aside. Just for a moment, let's just put humans aside. Let's not forget the power that's in the land itself.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? When you go, no matter where you go in the world, there are sacred sites. There is holy land here in America where the natives place their holy sacred sites. These are places that are high commodity places. And so, you see these systems being brought in and getting rid of the natives from those places to then plant themselves on these sacred sites,
Mount Rushmore.
Utilize that for whatever the reason, right? So it's again, when you're approaching it from an esoteric / occult eye, you're looking at this and you're going, there's something deeper than just mean guys for political fascist reasons. You're looking at why are they taking over these sacred sites? What are they doing with those sites? Or why are they torturing and harming children? For what energetic reason? Because you're looking at it from that esoteric point of view of like, what's the energy behind all of this and what's the
right? Well, and the thing is that the way I look at it is that it doesn't even have to be a consciously done esoteric act. To me, if you look at Mount Rushmore, or Mount Rushless, as I put it, this was a sacred spot, the sacred spot of the six grandfathers, and it's actually within a reservation. I mean, it is completely surrounded by, a reservation. It was a holy spot, and it was picked very specifically in order to subdue the Lakota who are there, and the guy who carved it, I posted about it on Facebook. The guy was a member of the KKK. He was a known member of the KKK. Now, they pick a sacred site, and they carve these kind of iconic white guys onto there. They're supposed to be our sacred fathers. Now, I don't know that this Ku Klux Klan dude was esoteric in any. I mean, this was before Hitler, was esoteric in any normal occult sense of the word, but that is a symbolic spiritual act, and it operates that way because it has to do with symbols. It has to do with narrative. It has to do with trying to rewrite history. This is our land. This is our place. These are our dudes. And that's ultimately what magic is. Magic is about creating narratives and realities and developing different types of relationships with different types of energy and forces. And so, what we're seeing in esoteric Hitlerism is an attempt to a fairly intense attempt to recreate, or actually just kind of invent out of whole cloth and a whole bunch of other crap, a different narrative about, who white people are and why white people should be on top.
Exactly.
And this extends so far as to reinterpreting, the cyclic cosmology of Hinduism, to completely recasting the story of the planet itself.
You know, and it's so far beyond appropriation. It's beyond it. It's stealing and then reframing to change the narrative so that you, the oppressor and the conqueror, are now on top and you own this. And I think that's another reason why people going around and destroying statues and burning flags and making these statements, I think that's why it's so important. I don't feel that these acts are acts of vandalism and horrible acts. I feel that it is the oppressed people taking their narrative back, taking the things that were taken from them and taking it back, or taking the parts of the story that were put in there that weren't supposed to be there and removing it. And I think that that is so important because those are symbols, and magically that is so important for our energy and for our practices so that we can regain the narrative again. Does that make sense?
Well, right. And all ruling groups, whoever the ruler is, all ruling groups have their narrative, why they're there, and I mean, this is not new. I mean, if you go back to like ancient Egypt, I mean, they were like spin masters about, concealing the faults of this pharaoh, I mean, they really were. I mean, they, and certainly the Chinese have always done that with their emperors. So like, it's not like, white people are unique in this, but what basically has occurred is that for a brief period of time, for about a 400 or 500 year history, you have had an ascendancy of a particular style of civilization. And the style of civilization has been characterized by certain symbols, which were picked up by Christianity and encoded in different kinds of economic systems, like both capitalism and socialism, which, by the way, are actually, they come from the same place. This is why they'll always war with each other. And what we're told is part of that narrative is that they're the only two options you have. And we know that's bullshit because we know that things existed prior to both of these things. So right. It's crazy. So it's kind of a false fight, actually, between those two. So we've had this period of about 400 and 500 years of the ascendancy, the rise and fall, if you will, of what we call Western civilization. And I would encourage everyone who hasn't had the stomach to do it yet to go and actually read, because I don't suppose you'd want to listen, to read the transcript of the speech that 45 gave last night at Mount Rushmore, because it is fascist at its core.
Wow.
And it is summoning up all of that mythology about Western civilization and about how America is sort of the apex of Western civilization, and that there are these forces in the world, in our nation, that are trying to destroy this legacy. And I mean, it's like, I read about 3 paragraphs of it and said, well, I've read this before, but don't see it as not a magical incantation. It is. It's an invocation to a particular way of seeing the world. So what's important, I think, for everyone to understand, because at some point we're going to talk about what we can do, and this goes into, you're talking about, the tearing down of symbols and everything, is to understand that what's really at stake is a view of the world.
Yeah.
Not just at the level of historical narrative, but at the level of spirit. It's like, who do you want to align yourself with? Do you want to align yourself with, as the Zoroastrians put it, do you want to align yourself with the liar, the lords of the lie, or do you want to align yourself, because the lords of the lie are in you too. They're not just out here. They're not just in Trump. They're also in you. If you've been brought up in this culture, if you've been brought up in the United States, then you have been deeply inculcated in racial politics. There's no way to escape it. It doesn't matter what color you are. You've lived it one way, somewhere, one way or the other. You've either benefited from it or not, but you've lived in it, and it's part of your indoctrination. So am I going to think in these narrow terms that are given to me, or am I going to walk that very narrow path, which is my narrow path, that very narrow path towards the light that includes everyone?
Right.
No matter how
I have a question for you, because I feel like I think we've established already the psychology behind all of this. I mean, you speak very much about the rat lines, going from place to place, collecting symbols, collecting mythologies, creating their own mythologies. It is coming from a place of victimhood and feeling, like there's a loss of identity there and needing to fill that void. And I feel that, we're not making excuses. We are definitely not sympathizing with white supremacists and with Nazis. We are simply trying to understand the psychology behind them. However, I'm curious, now that we know that psychology, now that we understand that they're going from place to place to cultures and people who they believe are subhuman or not human at all, but still find something about their religious practices that they can take and bring within their occult practices. How do you approach a psychology like that? Like, how do you, when it comes to what you can do on whether it's spiritual or even just verbal, how do you even approach a psychology like that? Because that sounds fucking insane. That sounds insane.
But yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is that it's really no different than a person. And we all know people like this. It's really no different than a person who, for any number of reasons, because a person can be traumatized into this, or they can just simply be born this way or indoctrinated into this. I mean, it doesn't really, the origin actually doesn't matter. I think that the mistake that we make is by thinking that if we understand everything and it all makes sense, that somehow that will fix it. That doesn't necessarily happen that way. If anybody who's ever had, who's a drunk, who has had any kind of addictive problem, they will tell you that understanding the problem or the core of that problem only takes you so far. You have to eventually, at some point, simply make the decision that you're going to change. No matter what it takes, you're going to have to change. And so I see it sort of like that. It's sort of like, there's this, victim mentality has its own kind of rut. It has its own kind of, it's kind of like a record that's gotten stuck. And for whatever reason, the person has to keep revisiting this idea or this notion to feel like they have something inside. So if people are going around and stealing and appropriating and doing all this stuff, like Savitri Devi, for some reason, being a minor English aristocrat at the end of the Raj wasn't good enough for her. So she had to go to India and become a Hindu,
Right.
What the fuck is that about? I mean, lots of hippies do that, but I mean, like, how does that turn into esoteric Hitlerism? Who knows? I mean, I don't really want to get into her brain to know how that works. I mean, do you? I mean, seriously, but at some point, what happens with a lot of people is they do this because they don't feel like, for some reason, whatever it is, that they don't have what it takes inside. They are lacking a certain kind of faith in themselves or faith in the world or faith in, it's like what fundamentalists do. Fundamentalists want to control the world because they feel like they're out of control. The world isn't acting the way they want it to act. And my response to that is, well, so it never does. So right. What's your problem? I mean, if you don't like that, go live in your house and develop your world and your community and be pure. Fine, no problem.
I mean, that's actually the basis of Christianity. You literally, in order to be a good Christian, you have to first believe that we are all sinners. We all have to first believe that we're fucked up and need to be fixed in order to then. Right.
But then, it's like, then you also, though, you have to have the faith that you can be.
Right.
Which is what the whole, people who have healthy Christianity, they get to that point, that Christ, the experience of that offers them the possibility to fix that, whatever that is, which means that salvation is possible. And then you help other people do that, and that is, that's basic humane spirituality, regardless of what religion you are. You know what I mean? But if you go around feeling like you're lacking, but everybody else has cool stuff, and I want that, and I want that, and I want that. What that means is that on some level inside of yourself, you don't feel like you have enough. You have a poverty mentality, or as Cortez put it in very materialistic ways to, you know, the ruler, one of the rulers of Tenochtitlan, you know, we Spanish have a disease of the heart that only gold can cure. I mean, he literally said that.
Wow.
Okay. Which should tell you something about Cortez. I mean, that's like an honest, the honesty there is kind of startling. You know, it's sort of like the villain revealing himself immediately, you know. So this, to me, the way I approach this, and you know, I think I told you I grew up with a lot of this. My father is a fundamentalist Christian. Now he is not a racist in the classic sense, and he doesn't believe in any of this crap, you know. But he does have some of that lack inside of himself that he has used Christianity to fill. Okay, although he did try to control his family and some of the people around him, he just wasn't as evil about it in a lot of ways. I think that part of the reason why people do this, I mean, other than seeing other things that people want, you know, kind of in an acquisitive way, kind of a spiritual greed, is that on some level there has to be this tacit recognition that the people you're getting this from are human. You know, they otherwise they wouldn't have anything that you want.
Right.
You know? And so it's this inability to see your whole humanity in another person, that, you know, whatever that wound is, you know, and it's not an uncommon wound. It manifests itself in almost everybody at some point in some way. It's just that it doesn't always become so marked in these like large political movements, you know. But I that when people say that the deep wound of the United States is the basis of our ideology of freedom in genocide and slavery, I think that sums it up. Because I mean, you know, Thomas Jefferson famously wrote in a letter. I mean, he kept slaves until close to his death, but he famously wrote in a letter to a friend that if there is and he's referring to slavery and his own owning of slaves, if there is a just God, I fear for my country. Mm. So he knew at a deep level that he didn't change his behavior, but he knew at a certain kind of psychological level that what he was doing was wrong. And it deeply, deeply contradicted on a political and even spiritual level.
So, I mean, in a nutshell, what you're pretty much saying is they know. This isn't ignorance. It isn't a lack of spiritual knowledge. It isn't a lack of mental capacity. It isn't a lack of anything other than they just choose to do this, to be this way.
Some of them. I mean, and there's a range of people. You know?
Yeah. But for the most part, for what we normally get exposed to, that's really at the core of it, really what's going on. I kind of want to ask, because there's so many magical people here in this live who are, you know, they're hearing this conversation, and just like me, had the same visceral response, which was, what can I do magically to stop this? You know what I mean? Like there's that visceral response of like, well, I can do magic too. I know esoteric, I know occult knowledge as well. What can I do? And so there are people who are curious, what can they do on that level to sort of halt this from happening? And I think you and I are both in agreement that magically, I think it would be very unwise of us to try and go on the offensive.
Yeah,
I think there's a term for it. There's a term in European magic called the egregore.
Mm-hmm.
It's called
egregore,
which is basically a form of protection that is around our system, that I believe is truly around our system. And this is just my personal opinion. That when you throw magic at it, or when you try to attack it, it literally feeds off of that and gets stronger. and
Yeah.
literally can manifest into an entity of its own because you've given it so much energy. And this is a great example of this is Trump's tweets. Any type of backlash he might get from the media, all of this stuff, we may think that we are attacking him when really it's feeding this particular energy that's around him, this egregore, if you will, and making it stronger.
Not that I think that we should ignore the political forces that are surrounding him at all. But I think that the whole country and the world would be better served if we all just ignored him more, just him.
Right.
It's this particular type of magic. I mean, I think the thing that I wanted to stress in all of this to your viewers, and this is important to know, is that esoteric Hitlerism is a stream now. It is a magical stream. It is an occult stream. And as such, there are thought forms, and it's on the astral. In other words, it has created its own egregore, its own momentum. So it's not the kind of thing that you want to attack directly, because what it's going to do is feed into your own fears. It essentially feeds on fear, and it feeds on any of your strong emotions. So anger, just intense rage, jealousy, anything like that. Even certain types of really intense sentimental compassion, it will feed, or guilt. It will feed on that. That's been my experience of this particular egregore. It's actually very potent, but the thing that it forgets, because all egregores are ultimately sort of large collective defensive ego systems that have been set up around particular stations, if you will, is that all of these systems always forget that ultimately all power comes from one source, whatever that source is, the source of the universe, whatever you want to call it. It all, everything ultimately comes from one place. And that place is just simply the place of power. And it's activated most potently. And this is not, I'm not saying this in any sentimental way at all, because, love can blast your face off, if it can, faith, when they say faith can move mountains, I think that's meant literally, in a lot of ways. What I would say to your magical practitioners is, whatever practices that you do sincerely and most strongly in love and in community and in service, keep doing those, and do those powerfully, and do those and multiply those, and work on that, and create different stories. Here I've given you a story, or a set of stories that are intended to conquer the world. I know this sounds like a crazy movie, but it is kind of a crazy movie. I mean, we're in a crazy movie that actually manifests physically. Yep. So, it is like the Matrix movie in a sense, in that regard. So it's like, create those new stories, learn new stories. And this is what I was going to show you. If you want to know, like, if you want to decolonize, give yourself some new stories.
Decolonize your mind. Let's see what she got for us.
Got lovely things here. And these, if you can, I don't know if this book is in print, but if you can get it, I would recommend it. It's called the Mishomis book. It's the voice of the Ojibwe. This is like actually one of the best introductions to Algonquin cosmology you can get. It's done like a kid's book, but nice. It's chock full. It's like if you're spiritually minded, you'll start reading this and you'll go into trance, just like that. Just and all of this stuff has been approved. In other words, the Ojibwe have approved the release. This is not all their esoteric stuff, but they have approved the release of this material for the betterment of the planet, especially Turtle Island, upon which we live. Then there is this book, which I have just gotten. by Barbara Alice Mann, and it is the indigenous decolonizing North America, spirits of blood, spirits of breath, the twinned cosmos of indigenous America. It is fabulous. Oh my God. And she's such a funny writer. She's like, she's an academic, but she refers to academia as yakademia. And and this book you can read paragraphs over and over again, not because you didn't understand it, because it's so brilliant. It's the best book. And even though I know, and you and I talked about this, even though I know that Christianity is sort of under fire generally, because of evangelical white Christianity being full of its own canard. I always like to share this book because this book was a really important component in healing some of the ways in which I was brought up in Christianity. And it's by Albert Rabbitoe. It's called A Fire in the Bones, Reflections on African American Religious History. And these are essays. These are not even like really, I mean, he's a historian of African American religion, and he's retired now. But this book, I used this book, I used to teach a class in comparative, this was the comparative study of religion. It was more like just introduction to religious studies is what it was. It wasn't really comparative religion. And I always used this book as a textbook. The students loved it because they were introduced to something that many people in the African American community are very familiar with, but almost no one else is, the origin of the various African American denominations, and the importance, the use of the Bible and Bible texts in African American communities. But he doesn't just talk about that. He also talks about Black Islam, and the Nation of Islam, and other religious groups. It's just an amazing book. It's just an intro, but it's so. When I read it, I read it like 25 years ago. It was like a revelation. I was like, oh my God, why are all of us taught about this? If I had been raised in this Christianity, I would be a very different person. Now, maybe an African American person would say something different, But
I think it's important though what you're saying right now, because the books that you're recommending and the things that you're talking about, it really goes into the idea of exploring spiritualities outside, and cultures as well, outside of your own, with a sense of appreciation, with a sense of love and community, versus what we've been talking about this whole time, which is just kind of going from culture to culture and taking and stealing more so than, in an appropriative kind of state, but doing it from the sense of like love and appreciation and cultural communion, and coming together in that sense in divine love, not necessarily this mundane kind of like loosey-goosey love, but like this divine kind of love. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. And just a couple of others. This is a book that I recommend a lot, because not only because of the person who actually has become an internal teacher for me. I mean, he speaks to me internally. We have conversation. But because it also speaks to the effects of colonialism in Africa, especially West Africa, and the rise of early fundamentalisms in Africa, which if you know about all that, fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism actually goes back to the mid-19th century. And so this is a book about an extraordinary human being, a spirit of tolerance, inspiring life of Cherno Bokar. He was a Sufi who died, I think, in the 1920s. And this is a book of his teachings and his stories. And he was a most extraordinary man. I mean, he really was. He had this unique way of looking at spirituality and teachings, but also he was beloved by the Fulani, the non-Islamic pagans essentially around him, because he didn't insist they convert. He he was just he was just an enlightened soul, and he ended up dying in a very tragic way because of the politics of fundamentalism and colonialism.
Wow.
And it just, to me, his story should just be known. I mean, he was an extraordinary human being, and his legacy deserves to be spread.
Before we wrap up, so
one more book. And if you are interested in like really high level ceremonial magic, if that's your gig and you want to do that, you need to know about Paschal Beverly Randolph.
Paschal Beverly Randolph, okay.
Who was a 19th century Black American spiritualist, Rosicrucian, and sex magician who taught Crowley everything he knew. And this is the only biography, that has ever been written by this guy, although there have been a number of he wrote a lot. And he was American, but he ended up having to go to Europe because in the 19th century it was impossible for a Black guy to do this. I mean, he was Black and Indian, I think, like from the Caribbean. But he was an amazing human being and extremely prolific in his writing, and some of his stuff is being republished now. But he was into the classic occultism, tantric sex, all of that stuff. If that's your gig, you don't have to go the Crowley route. You can go the Paschal Beverly Randolph route.
I got to get me that one. I don't have that one. So before we wrap up, I just want to let everyone know, when it comes to what you can do. So obviously, magically, we definitely don't want to go on the offense. And we definitely want to commune with each other and understand each other, both historically, culturally, and spiritually. But I think also, too, when we're navigating these conversations with people, especially with people who may sort of have these white supremacist tendencies, or maybe on the cusp, or maybe just full on, that we still approach it with understanding, love, compassion, and knowledge. You know what I mean?
As approaching it passively at all.
Not passively, no.
Not passively at all. I mean, to me, Nazism is not up for debate. It is not something that is an argument to be had.
Right.
They want to eliminate all arguments. They want to eliminate discussion. And what they're trying to do, and that's part of the reason why I wanted you to listen to that recording that I gave you. Did I tell you about that guy? You can punch a Nazi if you want. I'm not going to encourage people to punch Nazis.
I will encourage it.
The way I look at it is, if you're a Nazi and if you are on a street corner and you are being a full-blown Nazi and someone comes up and punches you, you know what? You've asked for it.
I won't stop it.
I'm not going to punch a Nazi because it'll hurt me. I've got arthritis. But, it's like, if somebody else, and I'm not going to promote it either. You can promote it. That's fine. You can do it. Certainly, I have no problem with punching them in your mind. But although magically, I think that's another issue entirely.
Right.
I do think that there are certain lines that need to be drawn. It's sort of like the guy that you listen to. He comes off sounding like a really normal guy, and then at some point, it just turns. And you think to yourself, okay, that in other words, that's your limit. That's his limit. His limit is that of course, it completely eliminates people who are in the middle, people who are mixed race, people. It completely eliminates like most of the rest of the world, because humans are not going to achieve that kind of purity. That's just completely ridiculous. So you have to decide where your limit is. In my case, there are certain members of my family I don't speak to. I do have certain members of my family who have been like this on occasion, although not my immediate family. So there are some places I don't go. And everybody has to decide like where they are with this. And
right.
All have to be in exactly the same place. Just In the same way that we don't all have to be activists out there in the front line, activists are supported a lot spiritually and mentally by people that they know they can go to get healed when you get trashed by doing that.
Exactly.
So
just play your part. Play your part. Whatever your lane is, play it and do it with the most, with the most righteous, whatever, you know what I mean? Like, do it with just the good heart that you have.
Well, and absolutely believe this, because I do believe this, that since I believe personally that the power that the Nazis have, or that whole, the power that whatever esoteric power they have, the power that they have, all power comes from one source. I mean, I'm a Sufi, so I do believe in God, or I do Allah, or the source of all things, all that is. All power comes from that source. And I believe that source is ultimately a source of creativity and love and growth and development. And I don't believe, and because I have seen no evidence of this in nature, that growth and development is a result of shutting things down and dividing things into little categories and making everything pure. The natural world is this wonderful, chaotic,
diverse,
very creative craziness, and it's not going to be controlled by these people. I mean, it can't be. So you've got, when you talk about in your own work, when you talk about having that faith inside, having that faith that that light and life and joy and love are the way to go. Well, those are the only games in town. Those are the only things that are real.
You just have to have faith in it and move in that grace, move in it for sure.
Because what's really weird is that because in Islam, and this is not fundamentalist Islam, because they actually don't use this way. They don't do this. It's like, if you guys would do this, you'd pull your own heads out of your butt. But there's the whole process of exorcism in Islam is completely different than in Christianity, because what you do in exorcism in Islam is you recognize that the power that has invaded this person, that power's ultimate source is also from God. So what you do is you remind it, oh, by the way, it isn't about you. You're part of something bigger. And that pops the bubble immediately, boom, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, and the invading force leaves, because it remembers, this is not about me. This is not about me invading this person. This is, I have this larger responsibility to this bigger thing that I'm a part of, which we're all a part of. Right. So you take evil away by reminding it that it doesn't exist on its own, because it wants you to believe that it does.
Right.
That it is the power. It is not the power.
It's not the power. That's the facts. So, Professor Wham, can you show us your 2 books? And
yes.
Can you tell us how people can reach you, or if they want to take your classes, or whatever the case may be? What are some resources you can give?
Okay. Yes. This is a book I wrote. Let me see. It's always hard to get this on the webcam. It's
the final season.
This, by the way, is where Wham comes from. Wahaba Adia Al-Mawid. This is my Sufi name. This is a collection of 4 stories that are sort of written in a Lovecraftian kind of theme. The reason I recommend this book is that the first 2 stories in here, they're all sort of like horror weird stories, but the first 2 stories in here deal with occult issues, deal with occult topics. And the very first one, Sir Lytton's Confession, is an examination of the kind of magic that we're talking about, that Nazis use. And the kind of, it's not exactly what they do. It's not exactly what they do, but it's similar. So, if you want to get a sense of kind of the vibe of that, then you can read that. There are autobiographical elements to each one of the stories. And this story is available as an ebook on Amazon. I do have a few paper copies, which if somebody wants a paper copy, they can contact me at Professor Wham1 at gmail.com.
One, the number, or spell it out?
One. But the numeral. So Professor Wham, you can probably hear they're starting to blow up firecrackers here, right?
Yep, it is the 4th of July. Let's do this.
And then this is one that
I have. This is an amazing book.
Yeah, and this is I published this last fall, and because of the pandemic, have not been able to do all of the marketing stuff that I was going to do. But this has a lot of material on some of the indigenous stuff in the Hudson Valley and their traditions regarding contact with non-human spiritual beings. You can probably hear that.
Yeah.
Right,
but we can still
next door to me in my backyard.
That's okay. You're still clear. You're still clear.
Okay. Here, I'm gonna shut one window there. Okay. So those are the two main books that I would recommend from me. And the Mysterious Beauty is also available on Amazon or from me or as an ebook. You can get it as an ebook as well.
Yep, and you can find Wahaba online on Facebook as well.
Yeah,
do a lot of classes.
Wahaba Hadia Al-Maweed. I'm on Facebook. I do have a MeWe account, which I've gotten under Professor Wham. So if people want to connect with me, hi, I'm from Kansas too. I'm an old Kansas person.
So Professor Wham, thank you so much. Oh my God, thank you so much. I mean, once again, and I say this every single time I talk about you, I say that you're a human encyclopedia, because once again, you just give us just an unbelievable wealth of knowledge. And you still, I mean, we still kept it very service level, because each of the subjects that we talked about, you guys, I swear to God, could have been done 2 hours each by themselves. And so thank you so much for going in with us like this. I want to give some shout outs to the people who spent their 4th of July with us. Oh my God. So Merrick, Marius, Joe, Sugar, Tinzial, oh my goodness, Lucian, Elba, Danielle, Liz, Evelyn, Stephanie. Oh my gosh, there's so many people in here. I don't even know, like, I can't even Rob. Oh my gosh.
It might be, yeah, right.
Thank you guys so much, Sunny. Thank you guys so much. Someone is just named A. Okay, cool. Thank you guys so much for spending your 4th of July with us. That means so much. This subject, Patricia, thank you. This subject was a very difficult one to bring down to such a condensed level, and the subjects here were so controversial. And if either myself or Professor Wham go missing, we did not kill ourselves. We are very much love our lives. So, you know,
there's nothing that I have said that is not in the public domain.
Exactly. So we encourage you guys to definitely look up the books that she recommended, to look up the websites, to look up the names that she brought up during this conversation, because it will take you into a rabbit hole of information. You guys, thank you so much. Again, Professor Wham, thank you so much. And I'm sure next round, we're going to do something fun for the next round, I'm sure. You guys have a wonderful night. Have a wonderful 4th of July. Black Lives Matter. Much love to the indigenous people that are out there. Be safe, everyone. We are going to overcome. We are going to win. We will make it through. We love you guys so much. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Oh my God.